The snap of his fingers cut through the hum of the charity gala like a scalpel. I turned, not because I answered to him, but because I was curious who would be so classless in a room full of glass walls and seven-figure donors. Douglas, the man my son was set to call father-in-law, didn't even look me in the eye. He just thrust a heavy silver tray piled with sticky, empty champagne flutes into my chest. "You there," he barked, adjusting his silk tie. "Clear this away immediately. The board president is arriving any minute, and this place looks like a pigsty." I looked down at the tray, then back up at him. He had no idea he was already speaking to her. "Stop scrolling for a second. Have you ever been treated like you were invisible just because you weren't dressed the part? Drop a yes in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. I want to see who in this community knows what real worth looks like." I didn't blink. I didn't introduce myself. I didn't throw the tray on the floor, though the thought crossed my mind. Instead, I let my fingers close around the cold silver handles. The weight of the glassware settled in my hands, familiar and grounding. In that split second, I made a choice. I could correct him. I could pull out my badge, introduce myself as Dr. Valerie Sterling, Chief of Surgery and President of the hospital board, and watch the color drain from his face. It would be easy. It would be satisfying. But it would also be a mercy. And mercy wasn't on the menu tonight. I looked at Douglas, really looked at him. He was already turning away, his attention drifting back to his daughter, Grace, who was busy smoothing the skirt of her $6,000 gown. Neither of them saw me. Not really. To them, I was just part of the furniture, a function, rather than a person. It was fascinating. Actually, as a surgeon, I'm trained to look for patterns, for symptoms, and right now, I was witnessing a classic case of cognitive failure. Psychologists call it thin slicing, the brain's tendency to make snap judgments based on superficial cues. Douglas saw my simple black dress, my lack of jewelry, my quiet demeanor, and his brain instantly categorized me. Servant, invisible, harmless. He didn't see the calluses on my hands from thousands of hours in the operating theater. He didn't see the way I scanned the room, noting exit points and staff positions, a habit from years of managing crisis situations. He only saw what he expected to see, and that blindness was going to be his downfall. "Make sure you get those to the back," he added over his shoulder, dismissing me with a wave of his hand. "And try to look a little more presentable. We have important people coming." "Of course," I said, my voice soft, neutral. "I'll take care of it." I walked away, carrying the tray, my heels clicking rhythmically against the polished floor. I wasn't just clearing glasses. I was gathering intel. I moved through the crowd, becoming the ghost they thought I was. I watched Grace snap at a photographer for not getting her good side. I heard Douglas boasting to a group of potential investors about his guaranteed contract with the hospital. They thought they were the masters of this universe. They didn't realize they were standing in my operating theater, and I was just scrubbing in. I moved toward the kitchen, the tray balanced effortlessly on my palm. The smell hit me first, not the food, but the underlying scent of industrial disinfectant beneath the layers of expensive perfume and cologne. It was a smell I knew intimately. It was the smell of late nights and early mornings, of 36-hour shifts where the only thing keeping you upright was caffeine and sheer willpower. As I navigated through the press of bodies, memories flashed like strobe lights. I remembered the first time I walked these halls, not as a guest, but as a terrified intern, my white coat stiff and oversized. I remembered the nights I slept in the on-call room, missing my son's soccer games, missing birthdays, trading my life hour by hour for the chance to save others. I remembered the board meetings where men like Douglas talked over me, explaining my own specialty to me, until I learned to speak with a voice that didn't ask for permission, but commanded it. I built this wing. I secured the funding, approved the blueprints, and fought for every square foot of space for my patients. Every piece of equipment, every sterile field, every life saved in this building carried my fingerprint. And yet, to Douglas, I was just a woman in a plain dress, useful only for clearing away his mess. The irony was sharp enough to cut. He was standing in the house I built, drinking champagne paid for by donors I cultivated, and treating me like an intruder. He thought he was renting this space for the night with his checkbook. He didn't realize he was renting it from me. And the rent was about to come due. I reached the service station and set the tray down with a clatter. A young nurse, Emily, looked up, startled. Her eyes widened as she recognized me. "Dr. Valerie?" she whispered, wiping her hands on her apron. "What are you doing?" "Let me take that." "It's fine, Emily," I said, offering her a rare, small smile. "I'm just observing." "Observing?" She looked confused, glancing out at the gala. "Yes," I said, my gaze drifting back to where Douglas was now holding court, laughing loudly at his own joke. "Checking the vitals before the operation." I smoothed my dress, feeling the phantom weight of my white coat on my shoulders. I had spent decades fighting for respect in a world that wanted to keep me small. I wasn't about to let a man with a checkbook and an ego the size of my operating theater take that away from me. Not tonight. Not ever. Emily moved back into the fray, balancing a tray of intricate hors d'oeuvres with the practiced grace of someone who spent 12 hours a day on her feet. I watched from the periphery, my back against a marble pillar. Grace was holding court near the center of the room, a glass of red wine in one hand, gesturing wildly as she recounted some story where she was undoubtedly the hero. She turned too fast, too careless, absorbed in her own performance. The collision was inevitable. The wine splashed across the front of her pale designer gown like a jagged wound. The scream that followed shattered the ambient noise of the string quartet. "You idiot!" Grace shrieked, the sound sharp and ugly. "Look what you did!" Emily froze, her face pale, immediately apologizing and reaching for a napkin to help. "Don't touch me," Grace recoiled, slapping Emily's hand away. "Do you have any idea how much this costs? You are completely incompetent. I want your manager. No, I want you gone. Get out of my sight before I have security throw you out." Douglas appeared instantly, drawn by the commotion not to help, but to escalate. Instead of de-escalating the situation or checking if the young woman was all right, he poured gasoline on the fire. "Is this how you train your staff?" He sneered at Emily, who was now trembling, fighting back tears. "Pathetic. We pay a premium for service, and we get clumsy children destroying property." I stood 10 feet away, perfectly still. My hands were clasped loosely in front of me, but my pulse didn't jump. Every instinct in my body screamed to step in, to shield my nurse, to shut them down with a single command. But I waited. This was the hardest part of leadership, the pause. In surgery, you do not cut until you know exactly where the tumor ends and the healthy tissue begins. You have to let the pathology reveal itself completely. This was a stress test. I needed to know if this behavior was a momentary lapse due to stress or a systemic failure of character. I needed to see how deep the rot went. Grace turned to her friends, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial hiss that carried perfectly to my ears. "I cannot wait to get my white coat just so I can fire people like her myself. God, the incompetence in this place is staggering. My dad is going to have a word with the chief of surgery about this." The air in my lungs turned into ice. This wasn't just bad manners. This was a contaminant. Grace wasn't just a rude girl in a ruined dress. She was a future doctor who viewed subordinates as targets rather than teammates. She was a liability, a pathogen entering my sterile field. If she treated a nurse this way at a gala, how would she treat a tired resident during rounds? How would she treat a non-compliant patient? Douglas put a comforting arm around his daughter, glaring at Emily's retreating back. "Don't worry, sweetheart. Once I sign that contract tonight, we will basically own this place. We'll clean house." That was it. The diagnosis was complete. The infection was deep, aggressive, and systemic. They weren't just threatening my dinner. They were threatening my hospital, my staff, and the culture I had spent 20 years building. I wasn't just a mother protecting her son anymore. I was the chief of surgery protecting her patient. And the patient was this hospital. It was time to scrub in for real. I retreated to the shadows near the panoramic windows, blending into the dark drapes. From this vantage point, I had a direct line of sight to Douglas, who was now holding court with a small group of potential investors. His voice carried over the din, loud and confident, the voice of a man who believed his own hype. "It's a done deal, gentlemen," Douglas said, swirling his whiskey. $12 million over 5 years. Exclusive rights to supply the entire surgical wing. The ink isn't dry yet, but it might as well be. One of the investors looked skeptical. 12 million? That's a significant contract. Are you sure the board is on board? I've heard Dr. Sterling can be meticulous about vendors. Douglas laughed, a sound that grated on my nerves. Sterling? Please. She's a figurehead. An academic. She doesn't understand the business side of things. Besides, I have her in my pocket. A few strategic donations. A few nice dinners. She'll sign whatever I put in front of her. She knows where her bread is buttered. I felt a cold smile touch my lips. In his pocket, he thought he owned me. He thought my silence was submission. My careful scrutiny was hesitation. It was the classic empty suit paradox. Society rewards men like Douglas, men who are loud, who take up space, who project unearned confidence while overlooking the quiet competence that actually keeps the world running. He was an expensive suit with nothing inside but hot air and entitlement. I pulled out my phone. It was time. I didn't call security. I didn't call the police. I opened my contacts and found the number for Dr. Samuel, the chairman of the board and a Nobel laureate who had mentored me since I was a resident. Valerie. The reply came instantly. Samuel. Pulling up now. Is everything ready? Valerie. More than ready. We have a situation. Douglas Sterling believes he has bought the hospital, and his daughter believes she has bought a residency. Samuel. Interesting. Shall we correct them? Valerie. Aggressively. I slid the phone back into my pocket. The trap was set. The guillotine was raised. Douglas was still talking, expanding on his plans to cut costs by sourcing cheaper materials, bragging about how much margin he would squeeze out of my hospital. He was confessing to future malpractice, to endangering my patients for profit, and he was doing it with a smile. He had no idea that the figurehead he dismissed was currently holding the blade. I wasn't just a mother-in-law dealing with a rude guest anymore. I was the immune system of this hospital, identifying a virus and preparing to purge it. The time for observation was over. The time for excision had arrived. The air in the room didn't change, but the oxygen left my lungs. Douglas had finished his monologue, leaving the investors nodding in that polite, non-committal way rich people do when they're being sold something. But Grace wasn't done. She saw the attention shifting away from her father, and like a moth to a flame, she needed it back. She stepped forward, linking her arm through Douglas's, her voice bright and brittle. And honestly, she chirped, addressing the group, signing this contract is just the beginning. Daddy's connections are already paying off for me. One of the investors, a silver-haired man named Mr. Henderson, raised an eyebrow. Oh? Grace giggled. It was a sound that made my skin crawl. Well, everyone knows how impossible it is to get a surgical residency here. The acceptance rate is like 0.0%, but I didn't even have to stress about my boards. She leaned in conspiratorially, though her voice was loud enough to carry. Daddy knows the chief of surgery. Dr. Sterling? Apparently, she's a total pushover for donors. My spot is already guaranteed. I basically skipped the line. The investors chuckled politely, but I saw the flicker of unease in Henderson's eyes. I stood in the shadows, my hands clenched so tight my knuckles were white. This wasn't just entitlement anymore. This was a confession. Grace was publicly admitting to academic fraud and nepotism, implicating me in a corruption scheme I had no part of. She was telling these men who trusted this hospital with their lives and their money that our standards were for sale, that patient safety was secondary to her father's checkbook. She wasn't just a rude girl. She was a danger. A surgeon who shortcuts the hard work is a surgeon who kills patients. She didn't want to earn the right to cut. She wanted to buy it. Is that so? Henderson asked, his tone cooling. I thought Dr. Sterling had a reputation for being rigorous. Oh, please. Douglas waved a hand, emboldened by his daughter's confidence. Everyone has a price. You just have to know what currency they accept. Sterling likes her little galas and her shiny equipment. I write the check. She signs the papers. It's how the world works. I felt a cold calm settle over me. The kind of calm that descends right before you make the first incision in a trauma case. The chaos was over. The diagnosis was confirmed. The tumor had defined its own borders. They thought the world worked on favors and backroom deals. They thought merit was a myth for poor people. They were about to learn that in my hospital, the only currency that mattered was competence, and they were bankrupt. I looked down at my phone. Samuel's text stared back at me. In position, I took a deep breath, smoothing the front of my simple black dress. I wasn't the help anymore. I wasn't the mother-in-law. I was the chief. And it was time to cut. The double doors swung open, and the room seemed to inhale. Dr. Samuel stood in the threshold, flanked by 2 other board members. He didn't need to shout to command attention. His presence alone was a gravitational force. He scanned the room, his gaze sweeping over the investors, over Grace in her stained dress, over Douglas mid-laugh. Then he saw me. Douglas, assuming the chairman's arrival was for his benefit, stepped forward, beaming. Dr. Samuel. Just the man I wanted to see. We were just discussing the bright future of our partnership. He extended a hand, his confidence absolute. Samuel didn't even slow down. He walked right past Douglas as if he were invisible, his eyes fixed on the shadows where I stood. The room went dead silent. You could hear the hum of the refrigeration units. He stopped in front of me. He looked at the simple black dress, the lack of jewelry, the way I stood apart from the crowd. Then he looked at the tray of dirty glasses on the table next to me. Dr. Valerie, he said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent room. Why is the president of the hospital board clearing tables? The silence that followed wasn't just quiet. It was heavy. It pressed down on the room like a physical weight. I saw the blood drain from Douglas's face. I saw Grace's mouth open and close, no sound coming out. The investors looked from Samuel to me, the realization dawning on them with horrifying clarity. I stepped out of the shadows. I didn't need to raise my voice. I spoke with the calm, flat authority I used in the O.R. when things went wrong. Mr. Sterling seemed to think I looked the part, I said, my eyes locking onto Douglas. And I was curious to see how he treats the people who keep this hospital running when he thinks no one important is watching. Douglas stammered, taking a step back. I didn't know. You didn't say. I didn't have to. I cut him off. Respect isn't something you give only when you see a title. It's a baseline requirement for anyone who wants to do business in my hospital. I turned to the investors, who were now looking at Douglas with open disdain. Gentlemen, I apologize for the confusion, but I think you've seen enough to know that Sterling Pharmaceuticals does not align with our values. Then I turned to Grace. She was shrinking against the wall, trying to make herself small. And as for my residency program, I said, my voice dropping an octave, it requires grades, exemplary character, and hard work. It does not accept donations. And it certainly doesn't accept bullies. The contract is denied, I said, delivering the final cut. Effective immediately. The room exhaled. It wasn't applause, but it was something better, the collective relief of a system purging a toxin. I didn't wait for their reaction. I turned and walked toward the exit. Dr. Samuel falling into step beside me. The operation was a success. The tumor was removed. The air in the room felt lighter as security escorted Douglas and Grace toward the exit. Douglas tried to bluster, threatening lawsuits and phone calls to people he claimed to know, but nobody was listening anymore. Grace didn't say a word. She just stared at the floor, the wine stain on her dress, a permanent reminder of the moment her future unraveled. The investors watched them go, shaking their heads, already distancing themselves from the sinking ship of Sterling Pharmaceuticals. I turned back to the service station. Emily was still standing there, looking shell-shocked. She was clutching a clean napkin like a lifeline. I walked over to her, ignoring the whispers that followed me. "Emily," I said gently, "are you all right?" She nodded slowly, eyes wide. "Dr. Valerie, thank you. I didn't know." "You didn't need to know," I said. "You just needed to be treated with respect." I reached into my purse and pulled out my business card. I wrote my direct line on the back. "Come see me in my office on Monday. We have a mentorship program for promising students. I think you'd be a good fit. We need people who understand that medicine is about service, not status." Tears welled up in her eyes again, but this time they were happy ones. "Thank you," she whispered. "I won't let you down." "I know you won't." I turned away and walked toward the panoramic windows. The gala was winding down. The energy shifted from networking to genuine conversation. People were looking at me differently now, not with the polite disinterest they showed the help, but with a mixture of awe and caution. They had seen the scalpel, and they knew I wasn't afraid to use it. I pulled out my phone. One new message. It was from my son, Nathan. "Nathan, Grace just called me screaming. Said you humiliated her father and ruined her career." I asked her what she did first. I smiled. "He was learning." "Nathan." She hung up on me. "Honestly, Mom, I think I dodged a bullet. I'm sorry I didn't see it sooner. Valerie, diagnosis is the first step to a cure. We'll talk later. Love you." I put the phone away. I stood alone on the balcony, the city lights spreading out below me like a constellation. The night air was cool on my skin. I reached into my clutch and pulled out the small, silver pin I usually kept hidden my chief of surgery badge. I looked at it for a moment, the metal gleaming under the streetlights. For years, I had kept my power quiet, believing that my work would speak for itself. I thought dignity meant silence. But tonight, I learned that sometimes dignity means noise. It means standing up and reminding people exactly who you are. I pinned the badge to the lapel of my simple black dress. It caught the light, a small, silver shield. I took a deep breath, filling my lungs with air that finally felt clean. The tumor was gone, the patient was stable, and I was ready for whatever came next. True power doesn't need to be loud. If you agree that character matters more than connections, share this story. And follow for more stories about justice served cold.